For nearly 20 years, 2 murders remained unsolved. 2 women, 2 states, 2 completely different crime scenes. But investigators didn't know they were looking for the same killer. And when DNA finally exposed Rodrigo Hernandez, he was already sitting on death row, with one last secret to confess. It was February 18, 1994. Susan Verstergen was 38 years old. She was a single mother, a hard-working woman, and the mother of a teenage boy. Her son was 15. For Susan, he was the center of her world. That night, she was doing what she had done many times before, working. She stocked vending machines and shelves at convenience stores around San Antonio. It was routine, familiar, the kind of ordinary night nobody expects to become their last. But someone had noticed Susan, someone who would eventually become obsessed with her movements. Rodrigo Hernandez was also working in the area. Investigators would later believe that he had seen Susan before. He knew where she worked. He knew she often traveled alone, and he may have known enough about her routine to predict where she would be and when she would leave. That detail would become disturbing years later, because this wasn't simply a random encounter. The evidence suggested that Hernandez had watched her, followed her, and waited. As Susan finished her work and returned to her vehicle that night, she had no reason to believe she was being followed. But somewhere behind her, Hernandez was closing the distance. Whatever Susan thought the night had in store for her, it certainly wasn't this. She was attacked. She was sexually assaulted. And then she was strangled. At some point, Hernandez knew she was dead. And yet, he still had to decide what to do with her body. He placed Susan's body into a garbage dumpster outside a nearby church. Then he disappeared. The next afternoon, Susan was found. And suddenly, detectives were staring at a crime scene that offered them very few answers. There was Susan's body. There was her abandoned vehicle. And there was the location where she had last been seen. 3 potential crime scenes. 3 places where investigators would have to search for something, anything, that could identify the person responsible. Inside Susan's vehicle, detectives recovered fingerprints. They also found biological material on one of the seats. But there was a problem. The technology available to investigators at the time couldn't tell them whose DNA it was. There was no database waiting to provide a name. No computerized match. No obvious suspect. The killer had left evidence behind, but he had also left before anyone knew how to use that evidence against him. The investigation eventually stalled, and Susan's family was left without an answer. Her son had lost his mother. And somewhere in Texas, the person responsible was still alive, still free, still moving forward with his life. To understand how Rodrigo Hernandez became a killer, investigators later looked back at his childhood. He was born in Texas in 1973. When he was around 12 years old, he moved with his sister to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where they lived with their grandmother. He struggled. He didn't speak English. He was trying to adjust to a new environment while dealing with major changes in his family life. And according to people who knew him, he spent a lot of time without supervision. Then he found another kind of family, a gang, the Latin Kings. For a teenager who felt disconnected, the gang offered something powerful: belonging, acceptance, protection. But there was another side to that belonging. Violence became normal. Breaking rules became normal, and Hernandez's criminal behavior began escalating. By 17, he had already been sent to prison for burglary. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It became a pattern. He would get arrested. He would serve time. He would get out. And then he would commit another crime. The offenses became more serious, more violent, and eventually they would become deadly. But nobody looking at Hernandez as a teenager could have known exactly where that path would lead. In 1991, he was 18 years old. And somewhere in Grand Rapids, another woman's life was about to end. Her name was Muriel Stoker. But many people around Grand Rapids knew her by another name, Mary the Bag Lady. Muriel had once lived a very different life. She came from a good family, but decades earlier, tragedy had changed everything. The man she had been with for many years died in a terrible tractor accident. After his death, Muriel's life began falling apart. She struggled emotionally. She refused treatment. Eventually, she became homeless. Most of her possessions could be carried in grocery bags, and those bags became almost a symbol of the woman people saw walking around Grand Rapids. By September 1991, Muriel was 77 years old. She was vulnerable. She was frail. And she was alone. Then, on September 8th, something happened that would haunt investigators for nearly 2 decades. Muriel's body was discovered inside a dark alcove in a parking garage. She was naked. She had been beaten. She had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the head. One of them was fatal. Her belongings were scattered nearby. One shoe remained on her foot. The other was found near a bus shelter across the street. The scene was horrifying. But there was something else. Something that would eventually become the key to the entire case. Investigators recovered male DNA. At the time, however, that DNA belonged to nobody they could identify. There was no name, no face, no suspect. Just a genetic profile sitting inside an evidence file. And for years, that's all it would remain. The original investigators were looking in the wrong direction. Muriel was a homeless, elderly woman. The people who knew her understood the dangers she faced. But the killer didn't fit the profile investigators were expecting. The suspect they were looking for wasn't an 18-year-old gang member. And that mattered, because Hernandez was able to disappear into the crowd. He didn't look like the person investigators were searching for. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence sat quietly in storage, waiting. Years passed. Technology changed, and DNA analysis became dramatically more powerful. Evidence that had once been almost useless could now be compared against national databases. But Hernandez had already moved on. He continued committing crimes. He spent time between Michigan and Texas. He worked. He became a father. And yet, the arrests continued. In 1998, Hernandez brutally attacked a man with a bottle. The assault was so severe that he was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. That conviction would unknowingly change everything. Because when Hernandez was eventually released in 2002, he was required to provide a DNA sample. He probably had no idea what that sample was about to uncover. The sample was entered into the database. And then investigators got a match. It wasn't Muriel's case. It was another murder. Susan Verstergen, the woman whose body had been found in a dumpster 8 years earlier. The DNA recovered from Susan's vehicle belonged to Rodrigo Hernandez. After nearly a decade, Susan's killer finally had a name. When investigators confronted Hernandez, he initially admitted involvement. But even then, he tried to control the story. He claimed that he and Susan had been involved in a sexual relationship. According to him, her death had been accidental. He said he had been drinking. He said he had smoked marijuana. And he claimed that everything that happened afterward was the result of panic. But investigators weren't convinced. There was a fundamental problem with his story. Susan hadn't simply died. She had been strangled. Her body had been taken away, and she had been discarded like garbage. Whatever happened between them, the evidence showed a level of violence that couldn't simply be explained away as an accident. And then Hernandez changed his story. When the case reached court, he claimed his confession wasn't really his. He said investigators had written it and pressured him into signing it. But the DNA evidence wasn't something he could explain away. A Texas jury convicted Rodrigo Hernandez of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. Susan's family finally had an answer. But Hernandez wasn't finished hiding the truth, because investigators in Michigan were still looking at an old murder. And the DNA that had caught Hernandez once was about to catch him again. In 2009, investigators reopened Muriel Stoker's cold case. The evidence was still there, and now the technology had caught up with it. The male DNA recovered from Muriel's body was entered into the national database. Then came the result. A match. Rodrigo Hernandez, the same man who had been convicted of killing Susan Verstergen in Texas. The same man who had been a teenager in Grand Rapids when Muriel was murdered. Suddenly, investigators had a connection between two women separated by hundreds of miles and 3 years. The similarities were chilling. Both victims had experienced sexual violence. Both were left discarded after their deaths. And both murders had gone unsolved because investigators couldn't initially identify the perpetrator. Detectives needed answers, so they went to Texas. One of those investigators was Detective Erica Fannin. She sat across from Hernandez and tried to get him to explain what happened to Muriel. The investigators even brought something with them, a letter from the prosecutor. It promised that Hernandez wouldn't be criminally charged based on what he discussed during the interview. It was an extraordinary opportunity. He could finally tell them what happened. But Hernandez refused. He was polite, calm, even pleasant. That may have been one of the most disturbing things about him. He wasn't raging. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't behaving like someone who had just been confronted with accusations of murder. He simply talked. And when the conversation turned toward Muriel, he shut down. He said he still had appeals in Texas. He was worried that anything he said could hurt him. Then he said something investigators remembered. He claimed his grandmother had raised him to respect women. But investigators were sitting across from a man who had been convicted of sexually assaulting and killing one woman, and whose DNA had now linked him to another. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. 3 years passed. Hernandez remained on death row. His execution date was approaching. January 26, 2012. That date wasn't only important to Hernandez. It was the final deadline for the investigators who wanted answers about Muriel. They had tried everything. He wouldn't talk. He wouldn't confess. He wouldn't explain what happened. Then they realized something. If Hernandez was going to tell the truth, they might have to ask him when he had almost nothing left to lose. On the day of his execution, Texas Ranger Steve Jeter was brought in. The clock was ticking. The execution process was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m., and by late afternoon, Hernandez still hadn't given investigators what they wanted. Jeter went to see him. At first, Hernandez wasn't ready to talk, but the ranger came back. Now it was around 5 p.m. Less than an hour remained. The governor had not granted a stay. There would be no 11th hour escape from the death chamber. And finally, Hernandez began talking. He sat behind the bars. Jeter sat across from him. There was no dramatic outburst, no screaming, no tears. Just a conversation. The kind of conversation two people might have anywhere. And that was perhaps the most disturbing part. Hernandez began describing Susan's death. He acknowledged strangling her. He spoke about it with the same calm tone investigators had heard before. Then Jeter turned the conversation toward Michigan, toward Muriel. And eventually, Hernandez began describing what happened. He claimed Muriel had been involved in a sexual encounter with him. Then he offered an explanation for the shooting. He said his weapon had accidentally discharged. He tried to portray the killing as something that happened in a moment of panic. But the investigators knew the evidence. Muriel had been beaten. She had been shot multiple times in the head. This wasn't consistent with a simple accident. And there was another detail. Her missing shoe. Investigators believed it suggested she may have been forced into the secluded alcove. In their view, Muriel hadn't willingly walked into that darkness. She had been taken there. And whatever Hernandez's exact motives were, the evidence suggested that this was another violent sexual assault that ended in murder. Still, Hernandez minimized his responsibility. Even in the final hour of his life, he described circumstances that made him look less culpable. An accident, a mistake, a moment of panic. Anything that moved responsibility away from himself. But there was no changing what the evidence showed. 2 women were dead, and his DNA connected him to both. At 5:32 p.m., the interview ended. Hernandez had finally provided investigators with information they had been seeking for years. But there was no time left. He was taken to the execution chamber. His family was allowed to see him. He said his goodbyes. And then the process began. At 6:09 p.m. on January 26, 2012, Rodrigo Hernandez was executed by lethal injection. He was 38 years old. For the families of his victims, his death didn't erase what happened. It couldn't. Susan's son had grown up without his mother. He was 15 years old when she was killed. By the time Hernandez was executed, he was an adult with a family of his own. But no matter how much time passed, there was one thing that couldn't be restored. His mother. Susan's laugh. Her embrace. The moments she should have shared with her grandchildren. The execution couldn't bring any of that back. But it could finally close one chapter. And for Muriel's family, it meant something else. Her killer had finally been identified. For years, Muriel had been remembered by many people simply as Mary the Bag Lady. But she was more than that. She was a daughter. A loved one. A woman whose life had once been filled with people and dreams before tragedy pushed her onto the streets. Her final years shouldn't have defined her entire life. And neither should the horrible way she died. There is no simple explanation for Rodrigo Hernandez. His childhood was troubled. His family was fractured. He struggled with language and education. He became involved with a gang. He committed crimes at a young age, and those crimes became increasingly serious. But understanding those circumstances doesn't excuse what he did. Millions of people experience difficult childhoods. Millions struggle with poverty, instability, trauma, or broken families. They don't become murderers. At some point, Hernandez made choices, and 2 women paid the ultimate price for those choices. Susan was a mother who was simply trying to finish her work. Muriel was an elderly and vulnerable woman who had already endured tremendous loss. Neither woman deserved what happened to her. And perhaps the most chilling part of Hernandez's story wasn't that he could commit violence. It was how ordinary he could appear afterward. He could sit across from an investigator, maintain eye contact, speak calmly, talk about murder as though he were discussing an ordinary event. There was no obvious monster sitting in that chair. There was simply a man. A man who had learned how to hide the worst parts of himself. For years he succeeded, until science remembered what he had forgotten. DNA doesn't forget. Evidence doesn't forget. And cold cases don't necessarily stay cold forever. Eventually, technology caught up with Rodrigo Hernandez. It connected him to Susan. Then it connected him to Muriel. And finally, on the last afternoon of his life, investigators got him to talk. Not because he suddenly became remorseful, not because he suddenly understood the pain he had caused, but because the clock was running out. At 6:09 p.m., his life ended. But Susan and Muriel had already lost theirs decades earlier. And that's the tragedy at the heart of this case. For Hernandez, those murders eventually became part of his past. For the families, they became part of every day that followed. A birthday without a mother, a Christmas without a loved one, an empty chair at the table, a memory that could never be replaced. Justice may have arrived late, but it arrived. And after nearly 2 decades, 2 women who had once been forgotten by the world were remembered again. Not as victims, not as evidence, not as names in a cold case file, but as human beings whose lives mattered. If you found this case disturbing and compelling, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. Subscribe to True Crime Update HQ for more real cases, cold case investigations, and gripping true crime stories. New crime documentaries every week. Until next time, stay safe and never stop seeking the truth.